Hello, and thank you for joining us. I'm Madison Pitsch, and I'm joined by Secretary of Transportation Pete Buttigieg. Thank you for joining us, Mr.
Glad to be with you.
Now, you were in Grand Island yesterday to announce a $1 million project on a rail facility there. Tell me about it. Tell me how you guys landed on that project to fund and where that money is coming from.
Yeah, we were really excited to be in Grand Island announcing a bundle of 70 rail infrastructure projects happening across the country. And this is one of them that's going to make a big difference. It's on a short line called the Cornhusker, very important for connecting a lot of goods to where they need to be through those larger Class 1 rails that they connect into. But the infrastructure is out of date. So with our funding, we got $15.2 million that are going to go toward new rail, new sidings, which means that you won't have backed up trains because they can pull off when they're being serviced, and a new repair facility. That's adding jobs. There's already one employer called GMCO that makes products like salts and fertilizer that has decided to expand a facility there because of this rail connectivity. It's a great example of the bigger picture of how when we make good railroad investments, that adds jobs and it improves safety.
And am I correct in saying this facility is kind of unique? It's two lines about 3 miles apart?
That's right. So what this does is help them better link into a BNSF and a Union Pacific Railroad. And all of that helps these goods get out into the national railroad network. These short lines play a very important role. They're not the nationally known names, but a short line like the Cornhusker is vital for connecting agricultural and manufacturing related goods in. And that supports so many jobs. And even if you don't work in manufacturing or in ag or in railroading, you probably don't think about these things every day. They affect all of us because when we have smoother supply chains, that helps us keep shipping costs under control, which is one of the things that affects the prices that we're paying at the grocery.
Why is it important to the Biden administration to invest in things like this hyper-local rail facility? Do you think the improvement project or the facility after the improvement will create jobs? If so, how many?
Yeah, one of the reasons we pushed so hard to get this infrastructure package done, one of the main goals of President Biden and this administration, was because we know communities of every size benefit. Everything from airport projects that I've seen at LAX, or I'll be at the Denver airport shortly after this interview, or communities like Chamberlain, South Dakota. I was there a couple weeks ago, 2,500 people in that community, but they have an airport that's very important for medevac and crop dusting. The terminal's made out of a mobile home, and we're funding them to have a permanent building. It's less than $1 million. So in Washington speak, maybe it doesn't seem like a big deal, but it's everything to that community. And similarly, across Nebraska, we got more than 200 projects already identified in Nebraska just since this infrastructure package passed, knowing that they create jobs, they make us safer, whether it's railroad improvements that mean there will be fewer derailments, or whether it's streetscape improvements that could mean that pedestrians and kids are safer. All of this adds up to a better way of life. And by the way, I think that's one of the reasons why the bipartisan infrastructure package had bipartisan support. Not everybody, but there were a lot of Republicans, including Senator Fisher from here in Nebraska, willing to cross the aisle, work with Democrats, work with the president to get this done.
And how many jobs do you think that this project at the connectivity rail could create?
You know, right off the bat, we see 12 jobs being added that are related to the repair facility, dozens more that are connected to companies that are more likely to operate there. And again, that might not seem like a huge number in Washington, but you do that in community after community. You multiply that by the 70 projects we announced yesterday, the 200 projects we're doing across Nebraska, and 5 years worth of this activity. And it's part of why there have been 13 million jobs created around the country since President Biden came in, and more where that came from.
You know, we have one of the largest rail yards in North Platte, and recently we've had multiple derailments and a hazmat explosion that caused evacuations. Do you think investments like this one are going to make rail safer in Nebraska, in the U.S.?
Absolutely. Look, part of what we need to be doing is investing in a railroad system that suffered from underinvestment from decades. We also need to make sure we have the tools to hold these big Class 1 freight railroads accountable. When that North Platte explosion happened, we were following it very closely. FRA personnel, that's our Federal Rail Administration, got involved right away. I was on the phone with the governor because I know that that could be terrifying for residents in the area. Fortunately, they got the all clear relatively soon, but being told you got to evacuate your home because of a chemical fire, that is the last thing anybody should be dealing with as they go about their day. So right now, there is legislation in Congress called the Railway Safety Act. And again, it's bipartisan, but it hasn't been able to move through. We're pushing hard to make sure that happens because that would give us more tools to hold railroads accountable for their safety practices. And in the meantime, we're going to be out there in places like Grand Island and around the country, making those physical improvements that we know can also make a big difference for safety.
Now, the explosion in North Platte is one in just a string of train issues we've seen, freight train issues we've seen in the last year. What does that tell you about America's rail system?
Well, you know, what a lot of Americans, I think, didn't realize is that these kinds of issues have been tolerated all along, but they didn't get much attention. That really changed with the Norfolk Southern derailment in East Palestine, Ohio, earlier this year. That was the first time that many Americans woke up to the fact that there have always been more than 1,000 derailments every single year. That's multiple times a day. Now, that number, believe it or not, is actually down from what it was maybe 20 years ago, and that is because there was a lot of new work and new regulation after some terrible disasters that happened in that period. But we can't be satisfied with 1,000 derailments a year, which is exactly why we're pushing harder with the regulatory tools we have. We're making these physical investments so that the condition of the railroads is safer, but we're also insisting that Congress does its part and put in provisions like stronger tank cars so that they could withstand a problem if something happens, and stiffer fines so that we can hold those railroads accountable. Right now, even if a railroad gets caught in a safety violation that leads to a fatality, Congress has set a limit of about $250,000, which for a multi-billion-dollar company is just not enough to get their attention. So these are the kinds of things that we believe Congress needs to work with us on. And I had a very, very eye-opening meeting yesterday with railroad workers, representatives of different labor unions, talking about some of their safety concerns that they see on the job every day. We're going to follow up on that, work with the Department of Labor on that, and again, push Congress to act on that too.
You spoke a little bit earlier about the systemic lack of investment in this kind of infrastructure. I'm curious if you think that's a lack of investment on the local side or a lack of federal funding.
Well, my perspective is shaped by having been a mayor. I was the mayor of South Bend, Indiana, where I grew up for about 8 years. And what I saw was that local communities like mine were often asked to do much more than we could manage without some kind of federal support. So I think local communities have done the best that they can. States, it's varied from state to state, but a lot of states are putting up resources to match the federal resources, which is a good idea. It should never be an either or. But what we know is for the last 40 years or so, the federal government hasn't done enough. Now we're changing that, partnering with local governments, partnering with counties, partnering with states to deliver these improvements, whether it's a new bridge, a railroad fix, upgrade to an airport terminal, and again, it's in communities of all sizes in every part of the USA.
We're about 4 days away from a government shutdown. A lot of this funding for projects comes from the federal government. What can Nebraskans expect in the 4 days leading up to a potential shutdown?
Well, look, a shutdown, it helps nobody. It is something that can and should be avoided. And I'm looking at it from the perspective of course, all of the transportation systems that we're taking care of, including the air traffic control system. So a couple of things would happen immediately that would really be a setback for the progress we've made in the aviation system. You know, last year, there were tons of flight delays, cancellations. Now we've actually seen the rate of cancellations get back to normal, a little bit lower than it was before COVID, but that progress could be stopped in its tracks if a government shutdown stops us from growing the air traffic control workforce where we've got staffing shortages. You can expect more shortages, more outages if we are stopped in our technology work and in our hiring. Now, the other thing that is really upsetting to think about is that air traffic controllers, who are a good example of essential workers, right? They have to go into work. They're going to keep going into the towers. They're going to keep doing their job, but they're not getting paid in a government shutdown. And the idea that like members of the military. People who have such important jobs have to come to their often stressful jobs with the added stress of not knowing when their next paycheck is going to come in. I think that's just unacceptable. Congress needs to get their act together. We need congressional Republicans, first of all, to agree with each other on what to do, and then work with us to keep the government up and running.
I'm curious, what do you think would it take to fully get American rail on the right track? How much money do you think that would take? Do you think it's feasible? And more importantly, what would a healthy rail system look like?
Well, it's not going to happen overnight, but a better rail system is one where derailments are rare instead of daily, where fatalities are zero, and I really think that's a goal we should strive to achieve. You know, many years that's the norm for commercial aviation. Why can't we have that for railroading too? And it's one where on the passenger side, Americans can expect the same kind of service that people in most other modern countries can take for granted. You know, I don't see why a Japanese or Italian or French or Turkish citizen ought to be able to count on better rail service than an American citizen. We should have the best, and a big part of that will come through the investments we're making right now that President Biden has been working so hard to make a reality.
So 25, 50 years from now, what do you imagine the American rail system would look like, both freight and passenger?
Well, what we need is a system that is reliable, that works for everybody. That means on the shipping side, that means customers, that means communities that are putting up with blocked railroad crossings way more often than they should be, and workers. Right now we have a railroad system that works pretty well for shareholders, but not so much for customers, for workers, and for communities. That's part of what we're working to change. And then on the passenger side, what I envision and what the president envisions is Americans having a range of choices to get to where they need to be, including excellent, fast passenger rail. Now, I'm not claiming that we're going to have high-speed rail overnight, but even in the 5-year package that we're working with right now, that's going to be enough to help us begin to do high-speed rail work in a handful of places around the country. And then a lot of what we're working on is just maintaining and improving what we've already got, getting our railroad network back into the condition it should have been kept in all along so that we can do bigger and better things.
Okay. I want to dig in a little bit more into the Biden administration's investment into infrastructure, especially in Nebraska. We've got tens of thousands of homes without access to high-speed internet. And recently, the groundwater near Meade, Nebraska was poisoned after a spillage at the Alt-N plant. What do you think the Biden administration is doing for Nebraska in regard to other infrastructure issues?
Well, you know, my side is transportation, but that's not all there is to infrastructure. Again, I think about my experience as a mayor, and you know, something like water. And I've spoken with the mayor here, Lyrian Gaylor-Baird, who's providing, I think, great leadership in this community, and she's very focused on making sure there's strong and secure water for the future for Lincoln. It's one of those things that all of us ought to be able to take for granted, that you can go to the tap in your kitchen, get a glass of water, and you don't have to think about whether you're going to be safe. If that is ever put at risk, whether it's through hazardous materials or whether it's through lead pipes, then that becomes a major, major problem that needs attention. It's why we work so hard to make sure this infrastructure bill included provisions to eliminate lead pipes. And my colleague, Michael Regan, who's leading the EPA, is working to deliver that around the country. You mentioned broadband. Today, being connected to the internet is as important as being connected to the interstate highway system. You need it in order to thrive, whether you're working in tech or whether you're working in agriculture, and certainly if you're a student. That's why we believe every single American household ought to have fast, reliable, affordable internet. And through the infrastructure law, we're able to do just that, delivering the funds that are going to make that possible in every community of every size.
Yeah, my last question for you. You ran for president in 2020 as a Democratic for the Democratic nomination. Could there be another presidential run in your future?
I honestly don't know. Right now, I've got, I think, the best job in the federal government. We're building the future. It's also incredibly demanding. The public and the president have high expectations for me and for our department to deliver. So I'm 100% focused on that and really thankful for the chance to serve.
All right. That's it for us today. Thank you for joining us, Mr. Secretary, and thank you for watching.